John Heisdorfer never thought a tweet from Washington could kill him. The Iowa soybean farmer, fourth generation, had survived droughts, floods, and recessions. But in December 2019, at age 50, he took his own life. His family farm, over 1,500 acres, was drowning in debt. The cause? China had stopped buying American soybeans. The reason? Retaliation for tariffs John never voted for, never wanted, and never understood until it was too late. He was not alone. Across America, a mother puts back laundry detergent at the grocery store. The price jumped $12 since last month. She does not know why. In Pennsylvania, a factory worker celebrates news that steel tariffs will save his job. 3 months later, the auto parts plant where he works announces closures. 16 people on his shift get termination notices. In California, a small business owner watches his costs spiral. The aluminium he needs for manufacturing has doubled in price. He cannot pass costs to customers. He starts planning layoffs. These people are connected by an invisible thread. A policy decision made in the White House on March 1, 2018. A decision wrapped in the language of protection, strength, and American revival. A decision that promised to bring back jobs, punish China, and make America win again. But here is what nobody told them. Tariffs are not paid by foreign countries. They are paid by you. And the biggest trade war in modern history was about to teach that lesson in the cruelest way possible. Within 24 hours of the announcement, $60 billion evaporated from stock markets. Within weeks, China struck back, not at Washington, but at farmers. Within months, everything from cars to beer cans cost more. And within a year, farm bankruptcies hit levels not seen since the financial crisis. The cameras showed workers in hard hats standing behind the president. What they did not show was the math. For every steel job the tariff saved, 16 workers in other industries would lose theirs. The equation was brutal. The politics were irresistible. What if this entire trade war was designed to look like strength while guaranteeing failure? What if the people it promised to save were always going to be the ones paying the price? And what if this exact mistake had been made before, turned a recession into the Great Depression, and somehow we forgot? This is not the story you heard on the news. This is what actually happened. The hidden costs, the forgotten victims, the quiet winners, and why the cycle keeps repeating, no matter how loudly history screams its warnings. If you want to understand what happened in 2018, you need to meet the ghosts first. The policymakers who tried this before, the workers who paid the price, the economies that collapsed. Because this story has been told before, in different decades with different faces, but always with the same ending. The 17th of June 1930. The Oval Office. President Herbert Hoover sits at his desk with a pen in his hand and a petition in front of him. The petition contains 1,028 signatures, every one of them an economist, every one of them begging him not to sign the bill in front of him. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a law that will raise taxes on over 20,000 imported goods. Thomas Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, warns that the bill will cause economic isolation and invite certain retaliation. Hoover knows this, his advisors know this, but midterm elections are coming. Farmers are struggling, factory workers are anxious, the political pressure is immense. Hoover signs it anyway. What happens next is not slow. It is catastrophic. Within weeks, Canada retaliates. Then Spain. Then Switzerland. France. Italy. Germany. A cascade of retaliation that moves faster than anyone predicted. By 1931, 25 countries have raised their tariffs in direct response. Global trade does not just shrink, it collapses. Between 1929 and 1933, world trade falls by 66%, not 6%, 66%. American farmers, the very people Smoot-Hawley promised to protect, watch their world disintegrate. Corn prices fall from 81 cents a bushel to 32 cents. Wheat drops from $1.40 to 49 cents. Export markets that took generations to build vanish in months. Farms that survived the Civil War go under. Unemployment explodes past 25%. Banks fail in waves. The recession that might have been manageable becomes the Great Depression. Economists would later call Smoot-Hawley one of the most damaging pieces of economic legislation in American history. But here is what haunts the story. It was not ignorance. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize political survival over economic reality. The same choice that would be made again and again and again. Fast forward to the 15th of August, 1971. President Richard Nixon appears on television with an announcement that shocks the world. He is closing the gold window, ending dollar convertibility, and he is imposing a 10% surcharge on all imports. The Nixon shock. Markets around the world convulse. The surcharge lasts only 4 months before international pressure forces its removal. But something has changed. Economic nationalism, dormant since Smoot-Hawley, is respectable again. The 1,980 seconds arrive with a new boogeyman. Japan. Toyota and Honda conquer American roads. Sony dominates electronics. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh bleed jobs. Entire communities built around steel and auto manufacturing watch their purpose vanish. The pain is real. The anger is justified. The solution is familiar. President Ronald Reagan, the champion of free markets and small government, quietly betrays both principles. In 1981, he negotiates voluntary export restraints with Japan. Voluntary in name only. Japan agrees to limit automobile exports to America or face something worse. In 1984, Reagan adds tariffs on steel. The restrictions save jobs. Temporarily, but economists later calculate the real cost. Each automobile job saved through trade restrictions cost American consumers about $160,000 per year. The money did not go to workers. It went to car companies who raised prices, shielded from competition. The policy was wealth transfer from many to few, wrapped in the language of protection. Here is what all these stories share. The pattern that repeats across a century. Politicians face pressure. Workers demand action. The economy feels rigged. Tariffs promise simple solutions. They deliver visible benefits to concentrated groups while imposing invisible costs on everyone else. The benefits make headlines. The costs get buried in spreadsheets. By the time the damage becomes undeniable, the politicians who imposed the tariffs are gone, and memory fades just enough for the cycle to begin again. Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley, the congressmen behind the 1,930 tariff, both lost their seats in the next election. Voters punished them for the economic catastrophe they created, but 70 years later, few Americans even remember their names. The lesson was learned, then forgotten, then learned again, then forgotten again. By 2016, when Donald Trump campaigned on the promise to bring back manufacturing through tariffs, the historical architecture was already built. The playbook was written. The mistakes were catalogued. The warnings were clear. And just like Hoover, just like Nixon, just like Reagan, the decision was made to ignore them. Because tariffs are not really about economics. They never have been. They are about something deeper. The fear of decline. The loss of identity. The desperate need to believe that walls can protect against a changing world. Understanding this is the key to understanding why the trade war of 2018 was inevitable. And why, unless something changes, the next one is too. Sarah is a single mother in Michigan. She does not follow politics closely. She works 2 jobs, raises 3 kids, and barely has time to breathe. In March 2018, when Trump announces steel and aluminum tariffs, she does not pay attention. It sounds like government stuff. Distant. Abstract. Nothing to do with her life. 6 months later, she needs a new washing machine. The old one finally died. She has saved for months. She walks into the appliance store with a budget of $600. The model she researched online costs $789. The salesperson apologizes. Prices went up. She asks why. He shrugs. She leaves without the washing machine. She will keep using the laundromat. It costs more over time. But she does not have $789. What Sarah does not know is that she just paid the tariff. Not directly, not visibly, but she paid it. Here is how the machinery works. When Trump signed the Section 232 tariffs on the 1st of March 2018, imposing 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, the policy sounded like it would hurt foreign companies, Chinese steel mills, Canadian aluminum smelters. The countries ripping us off would finally pay the price. That is what the speeches said. That is what the headlines suggested. But tariffs do not work that way. They never have. They are not fines paid by foreign governments. They are taxes collected at the American border, paid by American companies who import the goods. Those companies have a choice: absorb the cost and accept smaller profits, or pass the cost along. Almost universally, they choose the latter. So when Whirlpool imports steel to make washing machines, they pay 25% more. They raise prices. Samsung and LG, importing finished washing machines, face tariffs on the complete units. They raise prices. And here is the twist. Whirlpool, even though they make machines domestically, raises their prices too. Why? Because they can. Competition just got more expensive. Basic economics. When your competitors' costs rise, you can raise prices without losing market share. By the end of 2018, washing machine prices increased by roughly 12%. Dryers, which faced no tariffs, increased by 11% because they are usually bought together. American consumers paid an estimated $1.5 billion more for laundry appliances in the first year after tariffs. That is billion, with a B. Economists calculated the cost per job created in washing machine manufacturing: $817,000. Per job. Per year. Sarah, standing in that appliance store, unable to afford a washing machine, effectively paid part of someone else's salary. Except the salary never materialized. Whirlpool announced layoffs anyway. This is not anecdotal. This is the mechanism. Multiply Sarah's story by millions of transactions across thousands of products, and you begin to see the scale. Now, zoom out. Steel is not a consumer product. It is an input, raw material for industries employing millions. When steel prices jump 30%, which they did within 6 months of the tariffs, the effect cascades. Automobile manufacturers, who use tons of steel per vehicle, suddenly face massive cost increases. Ford estimated the tariffs would cost them $1 billion in profits. General Motors projected similar losses. They cannot absorb that. They raise vehicle prices. They delay investments. They cancel planned hiring. Construction companies face higher costs for steel beams, rebar, metal framing. They pass costs to developers. Developers pass costs to buyers. Home prices rise. Commercial projects get delayed or cancelled. Workers who would have been hired never get the call. Beverage companies, believe it or not, become victims. Beer and soda cans use aluminum. Miller Coors said the tariffs would cost them $40 million annually. They considered switching to glass bottles, which would require new equipment, new supply chains, new logistics, or they raise prices. Consumers pay more for beer. Not because hops got expensive, because of tariffs on aluminum from Canada. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York studied this carefully. They found that tariffs were essentially 100% passed through to consumers. For every dollar of tariff collected, American consumers and businesses paid $1 in higher prices. There was no magical punishment of China. There was just redistribution of money from American buyers to American sellers in protected industries, and to the government in tariff revenue. By the end of 2019, American consumers and businesses had paid roughly $80 billion in tariff costs. The typical household saw an effective tax increase of about $1,000 per year. This is not theoretical. This is measured, documented, undeniable. But here is where it gets darker. The tariffs created about 1,900 jobs in steel manufacturing. At the same time, economists at the Federal Reserve estimated that 75,000 manufacturing jobs were lost in steel-consuming industries. The math is vicious. For every job created, 40 were destroyed. Not 16 like some estimates suggested. 40. Why? Because modern manufacturing is interconnected. A car contains about 900 kilograms of steel. When steel prices spike, car companies do not just raise prices, they also look for efficiencies. They automate. They move production to countries without tariffs. They cut jobs in ways that never make headlines because they happen slowly, across hundreds of facilities, over months. The Tax Foundation, a non-partisan research group, built models to project long-term effects. Their conclusion: the tariffs would reduce GDP by 0.4% over a decade. That translates to roughly $400 billion in lost economic growth. 480,000 fewer jobs across all sectors, and reduced wages for workers who keep their jobs because overall economic weakness suppresses bargaining power. These numbers should have ended the debate. They did not, because tariffs were never really about the numbers. They were about the story, the narrative, the feeling. Now let's talk about the retaliation, because China's response was not random, it was surgical. Beijing faced a problem. It could not match American tariffs dollar for dollar. The US imports about $550 billion per year from China. China imports about $180 billion from the US. If both sides impose 25% tariffs on everything, China's economy gets hit much harder. So Chinese officials made a strategic decision: target agriculture. Target products from politically important states. Maximize pain in areas that matter to Trump's political base. Soybeans became weapon number one. China bought about 60% of all American soybean exports, roughly 31 million metric tons per year, worth over $12 billion. In April 2018, China announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on American soybeans. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Soybean futures prices collapsed. Farmers who had already planted their crops watched their expected income vaporize. They could not simply switch to other crops mid-season. They were locked in, and even if they could switch, what would they switch to? Corn faced similar retaliation. So did pork, dairy, sorghum, wheat. By harvest time in fall 2018, soybean prices had fallen from over $10 per bushel to under $8. For context, it costs about $7 per bushel to grow soybeans profitably, including land, seed, equipment, and labor. Farmers were now selling at or below break-even. Rob Schaefer, a farmer in Ohio, told reporters he lost about $120,000 that year. His family had farmed that land since 1835. 5 generations. He did not want subsidies. He wanted customers. He wanted China back. But China was not coming back. Here is what China did instead. They bought soybeans from Brazil. Lots of them. Brazilian farmers, seeing opportunity, expanded production rapidly. Between 2017 and 2020, Brazil increased soybean exports to China by over 30%. Those are sales that will never return to American farmers. Market share, once lost, rarely comes back. Even if tariffs disappeared tomorrow, Chinese buyers have now built relationships with Brazilian suppliers. They have infrastructure in place. They have contracts. The Trump administration, seeing farm bankruptcies rise, seeing political disaster brewing, responded with subsidies. About $28 billion in direct payments to farmers over 2 years. For context, that is more than double what the auto industry bailout cost during the financial crisis. The subsidies kept farms alive. Barely. But they did something else. They turned independent farmers into government dependents. Farmers who spent generations building customer relationships, optimizing production, competing in global markets, were now waiting for relief checks from Washington. The irony was almost unbearable. A policy designed to assert American economic independence created a massive new welfare program. Farm bankruptcies tell the real story. In 2019, Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies hit 595, the highest level in 8 years. In Wisconsin, the dairy state, farms were failing at rates not seen since the 1982 farm crisis. The suicide rate among agricultural workers, already the highest of any profession, increased. John Heisdorfer, who we met at the beginning, was not an isolated tragedy. He was a symbol of a systemic failure. A failure that was predicted, a failure that was preventable, a failure that happened anyway because the politics demanded it. While farmers were collapsing and consumers were paying more for everything, some people were getting very, very rich. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it is complicated, because it undermines the narrative, because it reveals that trade wars are not really about protecting workers. They are about redirecting money. From many to few, from consumers to producers, from the politically powerless to the politically connected. Let's start with US Steel. The company had been struggling for years. Competition from cheaper foreign steel, declining demand from American manufacturers, legacy costs from pensions and healthcare for retired workers. Steel's stock was trading around $30 per share. On March 1st, When Trump announced the steel tariffs, the stock jumped. In early 2018, before the tariffs, US, by summer, it was over $47, a 50% increase. The company announced plans to restart idle facilities. They talked about hiring. CEO David Burritt credited Trump's policies. It looked like exactly what the tariffs were supposed to do. But look closer. U.S. Steel's profit surge came not from selling more steel, but from selling steel at higher prices. Domestic steel prices increased roughly 30% in the months after tariffs. U.S. Steel did not need to innovate, invest in new technology, or improve efficiency. They just raised prices because foreign competition got artificially expensive. And who paid those higher prices? Every American company and consumer who needed steel. The automaker in Detroit. The construction company in Texas. The appliance manufacturer in Tennessee. The homeowner buying a new roof. U.S. Steel's executives and shareholders captured billions in wealth, transferred directly from consumers' pockets. This is not metaphorical. It is mechanical. The tariff functioned as a regressive tax collected by steel companies instead of the government. By 2020, when pandemic hit and demand collapsed, U.S. Steel's stock fell back to pre-tariff levels. The company announced more layoffs. The promised revival never materialized. But during those 2 years when steel prices were artificially inflated, executives and shareholders extracted maximum value. Mission accomplished. Nucor, another major steel producer, followed the same pattern. Stock surge, price increases, profit jump, then fade. Nucor's CEO, Leon Topalian, earned over $15 million in compensation in 2018. For context, the median steelworker wage is about $45,000. The CEO made the equivalent of 333 steelworkers' annual salaries in 1 year, during which the company's success came not from innovation but from government protection. Now let's talk about the lobbyists. The mechanics of how this actually happened. For years leading up to 2018, steel and aluminum trade associations spent millions lobbying Congress and the White House. The Steel Manufacturers Association, the American Iron and Steel Institute, the Aluminum Association. These groups employed dozens of lobbyists who had one job: get tariffs imposed. Between 2016 and 2018, these groups spent over $20 million on lobbying. They contributed to political campaigns. They arranged factory visits for politicians. They funded studies showing job losses from foreign competition. They created pressure. And it worked. The return on investment was spectacular. For every dollar spent on lobbying, they received thousands in protected profits. This is how policy actually gets made. Not through careful analysis of national interest, through organized pressure from concentrated interests with resources to play the game. Meanwhile, the voices opposing tariffs, consumers, small manufacturers, downstream industries, were diffuse and unorganized. Sarah, the single mother who could not afford a washing machine, has no lobbyist. The construction worker, whose hours got cut when projects got delayed, has no PAC. They have no voice in Washington, so they pay the price silently. Let's zoom out to the corporate winners beyond steel. Every large company with sophisticated legal and lobbying operations could apply for tariff exemptions. These exemptions, granted on a case-by-case basis by the Commerce Department, allowed specific companies to import specific products without paying tariffs. Who got exemptions? Companies that could afford lawyers specializing in trade law, companies with Washington connections, companies large enough to navigate bureaucratic complexity. By the end of 2019, the Commerce Department had received over 40,000 exemption requests. Processing these requests required massive bureaucratic expansion. Companies paid law firms hundreds of thousands of dollars to prepare applications. Small manufacturers could not compete. The result was a two-tier system. Large, politically connected firms got exemptions. Small firms paid full tariffs. This created competitive advantages, having nothing to do with efficiency or quality. It was pure regulatory capture. Tesla, for example, secured exemptions for certain aluminum products needed for electric vehicle production. That is not wrong per se, but it shows how the system worked. If you had resources and access, you could navigate around the tariffs. If you did not, you paid. The law firms themselves became winners. Trade law specialists saw business boom. Firms that had small practices in customs and trade suddenly needed to hire. Associates who knew tariff classification systems became highly valuable. Partners who had Commerce Department connections could charge premium rates. There is a whole ecosystem of people who profit from trade war complexity. Consultants who help companies find workarounds. Freight forwarders who reroute supply chains through third countries to avoid tariffs. Lobbyists who promise access. All of them extracting value from economic inefficiency created by policy. This is the hidden cost that never shows up in economic models. When you add friction to trade, you do not just raise prices. You create opportunities for intermediaries to extract rent. You reward complexity over simplicity. You advantage size over ingenuity. You turn economic competition into political competition. And here is the darkest part. The people making these decisions knew all of this. The economists in the Trump administration, the policy advisors, the trade officials, they understood basic economics. They had access to historical data. They knew what happened with Smoot-Hawley. They knew the models showing net job losses. They knew consumers would pay the price. They did it anyway, because the political calculation was clear. The benefits would be concentrated and visible. Steel companies would announce investments and hiring. Those announcements would make headlines. The costs would be diffuse and invisible. Sarah would not know why her washing machine cost more. The construction worker would not connect his reduced hours to steel tariffs. The restaurant owner would not realize beer prices rose partly due to aluminum tariffs. Concentrated benefits. Diffuse costs. Perfect political economics. Terrible actual economics. This is why trade wars happen despite history's warnings. Not because leaders do not know better, but because they have incentives to pretend they do not know better. The system rewards short-term political theater over long-term economic strategy, and the people who pay the price are those with no voice in the process. The retaliation did not stop with soybeans. China's response was just the beginning. What followed was a global reorganization of trade that will shape economics and geopolitics for decades. On the 1st of June 2018, Canada, America's largest trading partner and closest ally, imposed retaliatory tariffs worth 16.6 billion Canadian dollars on American goods. Not randomly, strategically. Orange juice from Florida, whiskey from Kentucky, cranberries from Wisconsin, pork from Iowa. Every product carefully selected to inflict pain in politically sensitive states and districts. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, usually diplomatic, called Trump's tariffs insulting and unacceptable. For context, Canadian soldiers fought alongside Americans in Afghanistan. Canada and the US share the longest undefended border in the world. They are integrated economically in ways that make separation almost impossible. NAFTA had created deeply connected supply chains, especially in auto manufacturing, and yet, the relationship fractured. Not over genuine security threats, but over steel tariffs justified under national security provisions that everyone knew were pretextual. The trust damage was real and lasting. The European Union responded similarly. On the 22nd of June 2018, the EU imposed tariffs on 2.8 billion euros worth of American goods. Again, strategically targeted. Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Levi's jeans, bourbon whiskey, products that scream American and come from politically important regions. Harley-Davidson, an iconic American brand, immediately faced a crisis. The EU tariffs would cost them about $100 million annually. In response, Harley announced plans to move some production overseas to avoid the tariffs. Trump, furious, attacked the company on Twitter, calling for a boycott, but Harley was just responding to economic reality. If EU tariffs made American-made motorcycles uncompetitive in European markets, they had to adapt or die. This is the great irony of protectionism. It often forces the very companies it claims to protect to move production abroad. Mexico, also targeted by Trump's tariffs despite NAFTA, retaliated with tariffs on American pork, apples, potatoes, and cheese. For farmers already reeling from China's actions, this was another blow. American pork exports to Mexico fell by over 10% in the second half of 2018. India, Vietnam, Turkey, and others joined the pile-on. Each country calculated which American products to target for maximum political impact. The global trading system built painstakingly over 70 years, was fracturing, but the deeper, more permanent damage was strategic. China made a decision. If America was going to weaponize trade, China needed to become less dependent on America. Period. This launched initiatives that will reshape the global economy. Made in China 2025, Beijing's industrial policy accelerated. The goal: achieve self-sufficiency in 10 high-tech sectors including semiconductors, artificial intelligence, robotics, and aerospace. China began pouring hundreds of billions into domestic research and development. They offered massive subsidies to Chinese tech companies. They restricted technology transfer to foreign firms. They essentially declared economic Cold War. In agriculture, China diversified suppliers aggressively. Brazilian soybean production expanded. Argentine beef exports to China grew. Russian wheat sales increased. Australia secured long-term contracts. The strategy was clear: never again be vulnerable to American agricultural leverage. China also accelerated creation of alternative trade architectures, excluding America. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, signed in November 2020, created the world's largest free trade zone. 15 countries including China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the 10 ASEAN nations, covering about 30% of global GDP and population. Notably absent, the United States. RCEP was not just about tariffs. It standardized rules, created common frameworks, integrated supply chains. It represented a fundamental shift. For decades, American-led institutions like the WTO set global trade rules. Now, a China-led alternative was emerging, and America, by withdrawing from trade leadership, by abandoning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, by starting trade wars with allies, had essentially invited this development. Europe, caught between America and China, began hedging. The EU negotiated its own trade deals. It strengthened relationships with Asian partners. It signaled that if America was unreliable, Europe would act independently. The geopolitical consequences became clear. Tariffs were not just raising prices, they were accelerating the end of American economic hegemony. The post-World War II order, where America set rules and others followed, was dissolving. Multipolarity was emerging, and trade wars were the catalyst. American multinational corporations watched this with alarm. Companies like Apple, which manufactured iPhones in China for sale globally, faced nightmare scenarios. If trade war escalated to complete decoupling, their entire business model collapsed. They lobbied hard for de-escalation. They got partially heard, hence the Phase 1 deal in early 2020 that paused some tariffs. But the damage was done. Supply chains that took decades to optimize were being rethought. Companies began moving production out of China, not back to America as Trump hoped, but to Vietnam, Mexico, India, anywhere that avoided tariffs. This was expensive and disruptive. It reduced efficiency. It raised costs. But it was necessary for risk management. The pandemic in 2020 then turbocharged these trends. Suddenly, supply chain resilience mattered more than pure efficiency. Countries that had grown comfortable with global interdependence began talking about strategic autonomy. Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth minerals, these became national security issues. The era of frictionless globalization was over, and here is the tragedy. Much of this was predictable. Economists had warned that weaponizing trade would invite retaliation and strategic decoupling, but the warnings were ignored because the politics demanded action that felt strong, regardless of long-term consequences. By 2024, the world looks fundamentally different. Trade is more fragmented, supply chains are less efficient, geopolitical tensions are higher, and America, which built the post-war trading system and benefited enormously from it, is now one of the forces tearing it down. The question is whether this is reversible. Can trust, once broken, be rebuilt? Can supply chains, once relocated, be easily moved again? Can institutions, once undermined, regain authority? The answer is probably not, or at least not quickly. The trade war of 2018 did not just impose tariffs. It revealed something about American reliability. It showed allies they could not count on consistent policy. It showed adversaries that economic warfare was now on the table. It changed perceptions in ways that outlast any specific tariff. This is the real cost. Not the billions in lost GDP, though that is substantial. Not the jobs lost, though those are tragic. But the systemic trust damage, the erosion of the very foundation on which American prosperity was built. The illusion that walls could protect, when in fact, they only isolate. It is late 2024. A presidential election has come and gone. Donald Trump has returned to the White House for a second term, and the promises sound familiar. More tariffs, tougher on China. Bring back manufacturing. Make America great again. Again. But this time, the tariff talk has escalated. During the campaign, Trump floated a universal baseline tariff. 10% on all imports from all countries. Some advisors suggested even higher. The Committee to Unleash Prosperity, a conservative think tank, proposed tariff-based revenue to replace income taxes. The rhetoric is not marginal. It is transformational. If implemented, these proposals would affect roughly $3 trillion in annual imports. Every product, every country, across the board, taxes on trade that would make the 2018 tariffs look minor by comparison. Let's game out what this means. First, immediate price effects. The Peterson Institute for International Economics modeled a 10% universal tariff scenario. Their findings: typical household costs would increase by about $1,300 per year initially, rising to over $2,600 annually once retaliation and broader economic effects kicked in. For middle-class families already stretched thin by inflation, this is devastating. Everything gets more expensive. Not just big-ticket items like cars and appliances, but everyday goods, clothing, electronics, furniture, toys, tools, food items. Anything imported, which in modern America is almost everything, faces a 10% price jump, and then domestic producers raise prices too because they can. Second, retaliation. If America imposes 10% on everyone retaliates. The EU, Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, all would respond proportionally or worse. American exports, already challenged by a strong dollar and global competition, face walls of tariffs. Export-dependent industries collapse. Agriculture gets devastated again. Aviation, machinery, pharmaceuticals, services, all face barriers. The Tax Foundation estimates that a 10% universal tariff with retaliation would shrink American GDP by about $1.6 trillion over a decade. That is the equivalent of erasing nearly a year of economic growth. Job losses would exceed 650,000. Investment would decline as uncertainty paralyzes business planning. Third, inflation returns. Just as the Federal Reserve has finally tamed inflation after the 2021 to 2023 surge, tariffs would reignite it. Sudden across-the-board price increases force the Fed to raise interest rates again. Mortgage rates jump. Credit card rates spike. Business borrowing becomes expensive. The housing market freezes. Consumer spending contracts. Recession risk escalates dramatically. Financial markets, which have grown nervous with every trade war threat, would react violently. Volatility spikes. Investors flee to safety, stock portfolios take hits, retirement accounts shrink. The psychological impact of economic instability becomes self-fulfilling as fear drives behavior. Fourth, and perhaps most dangerous, the accelerated decoupling from China. If universal tariffs get implemented, especially with higher rates on Chinese goods as promised, Beijing's response would be comprehensive. Not just retaliatory tariffs, but export controls on critical materials. China supplies about 70% of rare earth elements, essential for electronics, renewable energy, and defense technology. They dominate pharmaceutical ingredient production. They control much of the global supply chain for solar panels and batteries. Economic warfare could escalate to mutual assured economic destruction. American companies operating in China could face regulatory harassment. Chinese assets in America could face freezes. The second largest and largest economies in the world, deeply integrated despite political tensions, would be actively trying to damage each other. The global economy, still recovering from pandemic, would face a shock it is not prepared for. Now, maybe this does not happen. Maybe the threats are negotiating tactics. Maybe implementation gets watered down. Maybe exemptions get granted so widely that the policy becomes meaningless. This is what happened partially in the first term. Lots of bark, somewhat less bite. But the uncertainty itself is damaging. Businesses make decisions based on expectations about the future. If the future includes possible 10% universal tariffs, companies postpone investments. They hold cash. They do not hire. They do not expand. Economic growth slows not from actual tariffs, but from fear of them. For individuals trying to navigate this landscape, what are the signs to watch? First, watch executive actions on Section 232 and Section 301 investigations. These are the legal mechanisms through which tariffs get imposed without congressional approval. If the Commerce Department or Trade Representative's Office announces investigations into additional sectors, tariffs are likely coming. Second, track congressional proposals to limit presidential tariff authority. There has been growing bipartisan discomfort with unilateral trade policy. If Congress moves to reclaim authority over tariffs, it signals establishment resistance to escalation. If those efforts fail, expect more aggressive action. Third, monitor currency movements. If universal tariffs get seriously discussed, the dollar will strengthen as investors seek safety. A strong dollar makes American exports more expensive and imports cheaper, which fights against the tariff's intended purpose. Watch the exchange rate. If it starts moving dramatically, markets are pricing in policy changes. Fourth, observe corporate behavior. When companies start announcing supply chain relocations, production shifts, or major strategic changes citing trade policy uncertainty, they are seeing something in their political intelligence that worries them. Corporations have better information than the public. They employ lobbyists who attend closed-door meetings. When they act, pay attention. Fifth, watch agricultural commodity prices and farm-state political sentiment. Farmers are the canary in the coal mine for trade wars. If soybean futures start dropping, corn prices fall, or farm-state senators start vocally opposing administration trade policy, retaliation is either happening or expected. For investors, the playbook from 2018 to 2019 provides guidance. Volatility increases. Defensive sectors like utilities and consumer staples outperform. Multinational corporations with heavy China exposure underperform. Small-cap domestic companies theoretically benefit, but often suffer from overall economic weakness. Treasury bonds benefit from flight to safety. Commodities react to dollar strength. But more broadly, the question is not just how to financially prepare. It is whether this cycle can be broken. Trade wars happen because they satisfy psychological needs that economics cannot address. The need to feel powerful in a world that feels increasingly out of control. The need to punish someone, anyone, for economic pain that has complex, systemic causes. The need to believe that simple solutions exist for complicated problems. Globalization created enormous aggregate wealth. It lifted billions out of poverty globally. It gave American consumers access to affordable goods. It enabled technological innovation through specialized supply chains. These are facts. But globalization also created losers. Factory workers whose jobs moved overseas. Communities whose economic purpose vanished. People who played by the rules and still fell behind. Their pain is real. Their anger is justified. But tariffs do not actually help them. Tariffs make their situation worse by raising the cost of everything they buy, while providing false hope that the past can be restored. The hard truth is that manufacturing employment declined primarily because of automation, not trade. A modern car factory employs a fraction of the workers it did 30 years ago, because robots do work that humans once did. This trend is irreversible. You cannot tariff your way out of technological change. The harder truth is that competitiveness comes from innovation, education, infrastructure, and institutions, not protection. Countries that succeed in the global economy invest heavily in human capital. They build world-class universities. They fund research and development. They create environments where entrepreneurship thrives. They accept creative destruction while building safety nets for those disrupted. Protection does the opposite. It subsidizes stagnation. It rewards political connections over innovation. It tells industries they do not need to improve because government will shield them from competition. It creates dependency that becomes politically impossible to remove. But here is the most important truth. The choice is not between globalization and isolation. That is a false dichotomy. The choice is between managed interdependence and chaotic fragmentation, between rules-based systems and power-based systems, between cooperation and conflict. America built the post-war trading system not out of altruism but out of enlightened self-interest. Open trade created prosperity that generated customers for American goods, allies for American security goals, and support for American values. The system was never perfect. It had biases and blind spots. But it worked reasonably well for most participants, most of the time. Tearing down that system without something better to replace it is strategic suicide. And tariffs are the wrecking ball. There is a photograph from March 1930. President Hoover sits at his desk, signing the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Standing around him are congressmen, industry representatives, and advisors. Everyone is smiling. They believe they are protecting America. They believe they are doing something strong and necessary. Within 3 years, unemployment would hit 25%, banks would fail by the thousands, global trade would collapse. The photograph would become a symbol of catastrophic policy failure. There is a photograph from March 2018. President Trump sits at a table, signing Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. Standing around him are steel workers in hard hats, industry executives, and advisors. Everyone is smiling. They believe they are protecting America. They believe they are doing something strong and necessary. The photographs are separated by 88 years. The smiles look the same. Here is what tariffs actually reveal. Not strength, but fear. Fear of competition. Fear of change. Fear that the country has lost something essential and might never get it back. Every tariff is a mirror, reflecting a nation's deepest anxieties about its place in the world. Strong, confident economies embrace competition. They invest in education so their workers can compete with anyone. They invest in infrastructure so their businesses have world-class logistics. They invest in research so they lead innovation rather than follow it. They trust their dynamism, their creativity, their ability to adapt. Weak economies, or economies that believe themselves weak, build walls. They protect declining industries. They subsidize yesterday's jobs instead of creating tomorrow's opportunities. They blame foreigners for domestic policy failures. They choose comfortable decline over uncomfortable transformation. The tragedy is that protectionism becomes self-fulfilling. By sheltering industries from competition, you ensure they never develop the capacity to compete. By telling workers their jobs can be preserved through policy, you prevent them from developing new skills for new industries. By blaming China or Mexico or Canada for economic problems, you avoid confronting the real challenges of automation, demographic change, and technological disruption. And so the cycle continues. Economic anxiety leads to protectionism. Protectionism delivers visible benefits to concentrated groups while imposing invisible costs on everyone else. The benefits make headlines. The costs get ignored until they become crisis. Crisis generates pressure for more protection. The spiral accelerates. Breaking this cycle requires something very difficult. It requires politicians to tell uncomfortable truths instead of comforting lies. It requires voters to accept complexity instead of demanding simplicity. It requires media to prioritize accuracy over engagement. It requires patient, long-term strategy over immediate, short-term performance. None of this seems likely. The incentives all point the wrong direction, and so we are probably going to do this again. The next administration, whether Trump's second term or some future populist, will face pressure to act tough on trade. They will have tariff authority ready to deploy. They will have industries ready to lobby for protection. They will have voters ready to believe that walls can work. History will repeat because the lessons of history are forgotten within a generation. John Heisdorfer, the Iowa farmer, will have company. More farms will fail. More factories will close despite protection. More consumers will pay higher prices without understanding why. More wealth will transfer from many to few. And more politicians will declare victory while standing in the wreckage. The question that haunts this entire story is simple. Why do we keep doing this? The answer is simpler than we want to admit. Because the pain of truth is greater than the comfort of lies. Because facing the real challenges of the 21st century, climate change, inequality, technological disruption, demographic aging, requires cooperation, sacrifice, and transformation on a scale that democracy struggles to deliver. Because tariffs offer the illusion of control without demanding actual change. Sarah, the single mother who could not afford a washing machine, deserves better. She deserves policies that actually address her struggles. Affordable childcare so she can work one job instead of two. Healthcare that does not bankrupt her family. Education and training for careers in growing industries. Infrastructure investment that creates good jobs. A tax system that does not favor wealth over work. These are hard, expensive, politically complex solutions. They require long-term commitment from government, business, and society. They do not fit into a tweet or a rally speech. They cannot be solved with executive orders. Tariffs, by contrast, are easy. Sign an order. Declare victory. Blame foreigners when it does not work. Repeat. The choice has always been between doing things that work and doing things that feel good. Between long-term strategy and short-term theater. Between addressing root causes and attacking symptoms. Between reality and fantasy. And time and again, we choose fantasy. Not because we do not know better. The economic research is clear. The historical record is unambiguous. The data is overwhelming. We know tariffs do not work. We know protectionism creates more problems than it solves. We know the pain falls on those least able to bear it. We choose fantasy anyway. Because reality is hard, and in democracies, hard truths lose elections. It is quiet in rural Iowa now. The farm that John Heisdorfer worked is still there. His family sold it. Someone else plants soybeans in those fields. China still buys from Brazil. The market John spent his life serving is gone. The tariffs that destroyed it are still in place. In Michigan, Sarah finally bought a washing machine. She saved for another year. The price never came down. She paid it. She had no choice. She still does not know she paid a tariff. The connection between a decision made in Washington and the price tag at the appliance store remains invisible to her. In Pennsylvania, the factory where 16 workers lost their jobs for every one steel job saved is permanently closed now. The building sits empty. A for lease sign hangs on the fence. The workers found other jobs, mostly lower paying. Some moved away. Some gave up. The promise that tariffs would protect them is forgotten. The pain remains. The trade war of 2018 to 2020 and the tariffs that remain in place today cost the American economy hundreds of billions of dollars, destroyed hundreds of thousands of jobs, raised prices on millions of products, damaged relationships with allies, accelerated strategic competition with China, and failed at every stated objective. Manufacturing employment did not boom. The trade deficit did not shrink. China did not capitulate. America did not become more competitive. The only thing tariffs successfully accomplished was creating pain, distributing it broadly while concentrating benefits narrowly, and demonstrating once again that protectionism is a costly illusion. But here is what should terrify you. We are about to do it again. The next trade war is probably not a question of if, but when. Because the cycle is not broken. The incentives have not changed. The lessons have not been learned. Somewhere right now, a lobbyist is meeting with a government official, making the case for protection. Somewhere, a politician is drafting a speech about getting tough on trade. Somewhere, a voter is nodding along, believing that walls can protect prosperity, that tariffs only hurt foreigners, that decline can be reversed through willpower. The machinery is ready. The justifications are prepared. The historical amnesia is complete, and when it happens again, we will act surprised, as if this outcome was not completely predictable, as if history had not already provided the blueprint for failure. Every tariff is a promise that will not be kept. Every trade war is a fight that cannot be won. Every wall is an admission of weakness, pretending to be strength. And yet, the cycle continues, because the alternative, embracing change, competing through excellence, cooperating across borders, is harder than the fantasy of isolation. John Heisdorfer cannot tell his story anymore. But it is being written again, right now, in farm towns and factory floors across America. Different names, same story, predictable tragedy, preventable loss. The trade war never ended. It just paused. And the next chapter is already being written. The only question is whether anyone will read the previous chapters before it is too late.